What if I told you that one of the most promising economic policies in modern US history has completely backfired? Imagine a tax reform designed to turbocharge the economy, to create jobs, and to boost American prosperity. Yet in reality, it led to skyrocketing debt, rising deficits, and an economic situation that left many wondering, was it really worth it? We're talking about none other than Trump's fiscal policy, a strategy that promised much but delivered far less than expected. But here's the twist. While this policy was unraveling in the United States, another crisis was brewing across the border where Canada, yes, Canada, made a shocking move that could have wide-reaching implications for global trade. They closed their airports to cargo planes, sending ripples through the global supply chain and leaving businesses reeling. Isn't it strange how one nation's fiscal decisions can affect the entire world? What's even more surprising is how one country's economic blueprint, designed to make America great again, actually ended up challenging its own future. And now, as we look at the aftermath, we have to ask ourselves what went wrong, and where does that leave us today? The fiscal policies put into motion by the Trump administration have already had a massive impact on the US, on Canada, and on global markets. And with all the uncertainty hanging in the air, it's hard not to wonder, did Trump really solve anything, or did he set up a series of problems that no one could have anticipated? Now, as we break down what exactly happened with Trump's fiscal policy, we'll see just how the decisions made in Washington reshaped not only the US economy, but also its relationships with countries around the world. From tax cuts and deregulation to the fallout of a trade war with China, everything has had a far-reaching effect, creating an economic domino effect that's been difficult to reverse. But as we dig deeper, we'll uncover something that might surprise you even more. The fallout wasn't just felt within US borders. In fact, our neighbors to the north, Canada, found themselves at the epicenter of a global crisis sparked by the policies of the Trump administration. With this shocking shutdown of Canadian airports to cargo planes, we're left wondering, how did a move like this disrupt the international trade system? What role did Trump's fiscal policies play in this move, and what does it mean for global trade moving forward? Let's dive into these questions and more as we examine the full impact of Trump's fiscal decisions and how they continue to reverberate around the world. As we unravel the consequences of Trump's fiscal policies, it's clear that the intended economic boom never materialized as expected. While the tax cuts and deregulation were meant to propel the economy forward, the reality was a surge in the federal deficit that left the nation with a massive debt. The idea of boosting American prosperity through these measures didn't quite pan out the way many hoped. Instead of creating a sustainable economic foundation, the tax cuts primarily benefited large corporations and the wealthy, leaving the middle class grappling with the consequences. The fallout didn't just stop at home, it extended globally, impacting trade relations and the broader economy in ways we're still feeling today. One of the most significant ripple effects came in the form of the trade war with China, which was deeply intertwined with Trump's fiscal policy. The tariffs, designed to punish China for unfair trade practices, sent shockwaves through global markets. While some may argue that these tariffs were a necessary response, the economic strain they caused, both on US businesses and consumers, was undeniable. The aftermath of the trade war still lingers, and it's clear that the fiscal policy didn't deliver the robust economic recovery it promised. But the global fallout didn't end there. Across the border in Canada, a surprising development unfolded. The Canadian government shut down its airports to cargo planes, a move that would disrupt international trade on a scale few could have predicted. This action, although seemingly disconnected from US policies, was a direct consequence of the strained trade relations fostered during Trump's tenure. The decision to close Canadian airports to cargo planes had profound implications, particularly for industries that rely heavily on cross-border shipping and logistics. Goods that once flowed freely across the US-Canada border now faced unprecedented delays, and the consequences rippled throughout global supply chains. So, as we take a step back to analyze what happened, it's impossible to ignore how Trump's fiscal policies created a series of challenges, not just for the US, but for countries worldwide, from the ballooning federal deficit to trade wars and international crises. The true cost of these decisions is only now becoming clear. What do you think about the impact of Trump's fiscal policy on the global economy? Have these moves created more harm than good? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to like this video if you found the insights valuable. If you want to stay informed about the ongoing global economic shifts, make sure to subscribe to our channel for more in-depth analyses. Stay tuned for the next part of this story. Trump's fiscal policy. A quick overview. When Donald Trump assumed office in 2017, his economic platform was built on promises of economic resurgence, job creation, and wealth generation. His administration's approach to fiscal policy was aggressive and controversial, marked by tax cuts, deregulation, and massive increases in military spending. The central idea behind his fiscal policy was clear: boost the economy by reducing taxes for corporations and the wealthy, remove the burdens of regulation, and increase defense spending to ensure that America was economically competitive on the global stage. But did it work? Was this strategy the key to a new era of prosperity, or did it lay the foundation for a series of unanticipated problems that continue to reverberate in global markets today? Trump's fiscal policy was heavily influenced by the idea of trickle-down economics, a theory that has long been a point of debate. At its core, the theory suggests that if the government cuts taxes on businesses and high-income earners, they will reinvest that money into the economy, creating jobs and driving growth. In Trump's case, his tax cuts were designed to benefit corporations with a drastic reduction in the corporate tax rate from 35% to 21%, as well as to offer tax breaks to individuals. The promise was that businesses would use the windfall to grow their operations, hire more workers, and in turn, lift the entire economy. In the first year of Trump's presidency, this plan seemed to be working. The stock market soared, hitting record highs, and unemployment fell to its lowest levels in decades. It was easy to be swept up in the optimism, yet there was a fundamental flaw in the underlying logic. The tax cuts, while stimulating short-term growth, added massive amounts to the national deficit. The Congressional Budget Office, CBO, projected that the tax cuts would increase the deficit by $1.9 trillion over a decade. At the same time, the promised reinvestment in the economy by large corporations did not come to the extent that many had hoped. Sure, companies reported higher profits, but instead of using that money to create new jobs or boost wages, many chose to buy back shares or increase dividends, which primarily benefited their shareholders rather than the broader economy. Moreover, the deregulation efforts, a cornerstone of Trump's fiscal policy, played a significant role in shaping his economic legacy. The administration rolled back a series of environmental and financial regulations put in place after the 2008 financial crisis. Trump's team argued that these regulations were stifling economic growth, particularly in energy and manufacturing industries. By dismantling regulations on pollution, emissions, and financial institutions, the government allowed businesses to operate with fewer restrictions, potentially lowering costs. However, this approach was not without its risks. The relaxing of environmental regulations led to concerns about the long-term health of the planet, while the loosening of financial rules raised fears that the economy could fall victim to the same speculative practices that led to the 2008 crash. The dramatic increase in military spending was another pillar of Trump's fiscal policy. His administration poured resources into defense, with the Department of Defense's budget rising by billions of dollars. This was done with the claim that a stronger military would allow the US to maintain its global position and safeguard its interests. While the investments in the military were popular among certain sectors of the population and were viewed as necessary for national security, they also raised concerns about the allocation of resources. Should the US be spending so heavily on defense while grappling with growing domestic issues such as healthcare and infrastructure? For many, the immediate results of Trump's fiscal policy seem to confirm the president's economic vision. But the longer-term effects are far more complex and nuanced. In reality, Trump's economic approach sowed the seeds for a growing inequality gap. While the wealthiest Americans benefited immensely from tax cuts, those at the lower and middle end of the income scale saw far fewer advantages. Wages for the average American worker stagnated, and the cost of living continued to rise. At the same time, the U.S. national debt grew at an alarming rate, raising questions about the sustainability of Trump's fiscal policies. And then there was the unforeseen consequence of the trade war with China. Trump's aggressive tariffs on Chinese goods meant to reduce the U.S. trade deficit and punish China for unfair trade practices, created a new layer of complexity in the fiscal picture. The trade war led to higher prices for American consumers and businesses that depended on Chinese goods, while the promised job growth never fully materialized in the manufacturing sector. The fiscal benefits that Trump had predicted from these trade policies never came to fruition, and the economic strain was felt both domestically and internationally. As the dust settles and we reflect on the fiscal policy of Trump's administration, it's clear that while some immediate effects may have looked positive, the broader long-term consequences are harder to ignore. The tax cuts and deregulation fueled short-term growth, but they also widened the wealth gap, increased the national debt, and left many sectors of the economy struggling to keep up. This leaves us with a question. What was the true cost of these policies, and who truly benefited from them in the end? What are your thoughts on Trump's fiscal policies? Do you think the tax cuts helped or hurt the economy in the long run? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to give a like if you found this analysis valuable. Subscribe to stay updated on future insights into the economic policies that continue to shape our world. The immediate economic effects of Trump's tax cuts. When Donald Trump unveiled his signature tax reform in December 2017, the country was thrust into a conversation about the future of the U.S. economy. His plan, known as the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, promised sweeping changes, slashing the corporate tax rate from 35% to 21%, offering temporary tax cuts to individuals, and incentivizing businesses to bring overseas profits back to the U.S. The idea was simple. By cutting taxes, businesses would reinvest in the economy, creating jobs, increasing wages, and fostering growth. But, as we now know, the immediate aftermath didn't fully match the promises made. At first glance, the effects seemed promising. The stock market soared, breaking record after record, with many attributing the surge to the tax cuts. Corporate America seemed to be thriving, reporting significant earnings, and large companies began announcing massive stock buybacks. For a moment, it appeared that the plan was working, and it seemed like the U.S. economy was on the verge of something big. Unemployment dropped, and consumer confidence was at an all-time high. Trump's supporters celebrated the lower tax rates, which they believed would empower companies to expand their operations and pass on savings to workers. However, this economic growth was not as organic as it seemed. While the stock market boomed, the benefits did not trickle down as intended. Large corporations may have enjoyed the reduction in their tax liabilities, but most of them used this newfound capital for stock buybacks, which primarily benefited shareholders rather than workers. These buybacks have been heavily criticized for increasing income inequality, as the wealth generated from these profits didn't reach the average American worker. In fact, despite the tax cuts, wages for many Americans remained stagnant, and the anticipated job growth in the middle class never fully materialized. This disconnect between corporate gains and the real economy created a growing divide. While corporations thrived, the working class saw little immediate benefit. Moreover, the promise of job creation didn't come to fruition at the scale anticipated. The reality was that many industries that were supposed to see an influx of new jobs were instead dealing with automation and outsourcing. Technology advancements and the globalization of supply chains had already been transforming industries long before Trump's tax cuts, and they continued to do so. What's more, while certain sectors saw gains, others, particularly in manufacturing, didn't see the surge in employment that many had expected. The U.S. economy's reliance on low-wage service jobs further compounded the issue, with large sections of the population finding themselves stuck in low-paying, unstable work. As much as Trump's tax cuts were lauded by conservative circles for reducing the corporate tax burden, they also contributed to a major long-term problem: the ballooning federal deficit. Before the tax cuts, the national debt was already a significant issue, but after the reform, it expanded even more dramatically. The Congressional Budget Office, CBO, estimated that the tax cuts would add $1.9 trillion to the deficit over the next decade. With less revenue coming into the government, there was less money available to fund public services, infrastructure, or even Social Security and Medicare. This posed an alarming question. If the tax cuts didn't lead to sustainable growth, how would the country manage the growing debt? In addition to the tax cuts, Trump's fiscal policies included a reduction in federal spending on social programs and a focus on reducing regulations on businesses. While deregulation was seen as a boon for industries like energy and manufacturing, it raised concerns about public health and safety. The rollback of regulations that were designed to protect the environment, financial markets, and the public sparked intense debates. Critics argued that these deregulation measures put the welfare of everyday Americans at risk, all in the name of corporate profits. Meanwhile, the tax cuts only seemed to benefit the wealthy and large corporations, leaving the middle and lower classes with little tangible benefit. Another layer to the economic effects of Trump's tax cuts was the question of how these policies affected the international landscape. The cuts aimed to incentivize companies to bring manufacturing jobs back to the U.S., yet they faced resistance from global supply chains and international competitors. Globalization had already made it easier for companies to manufacture abroad, and the U.S. couldn't simply reverse these trends overnight. While some industries benefited, others found it challenging to compete on the global stage, especially when other countries maintained lower tax rates or offered their own incentives to attract business. And let's not forget the impact on state and local governments. As federal taxes were slashed, many states found themselves in a difficult position as they were still expected to meet their budgetary needs. Some states, especially those that had previously relied on federal funding, now had to make tough decisions about how to fund essential services like education, healthcare, and infrastructure. This trickled down to the local level, where communities felt the pressure to make up for the shortfall in federal revenue. For all the fanfare surrounding Trump's tax cuts, the immediate economic effects were mixed. On the surface, the stock market rose, corporate profits surged, and unemployment fell. But the long-term consequences were much more complex. The wealth gap continued to grow, with the benefits of the tax cuts concentrated in the hands of the wealthiest Americans and corporations. The federal deficit ballooned, and the promise of sustainable economic growth through tax cuts remained unfulfilled. Moreover, the anticipated job growth in industries like manufacturing and construction didn't materialize, leaving many workers questioning the effectiveness of these policies. What are your thoughts on the immediate effects of Trump's tax cuts? Do you think the promises of job creation and economic growth were fulfilled, or did they fall short? Let us know what you think in the comments below, and if you enjoyed this analysis, don't forget to give this video a like subscribe to our channel to stay updated on the ongoing impact of Trump's fiscal policies and how they continue to shape the economy today. The federal deficit crisis. How did Trump's spending impact it? When Donald Trump took office in 2017, his economic agenda was built on a series of bold promises: tax cuts, deregulation, and increasing military spending. These promises were made with the aim of revitalizing the economy, creating jobs, and strengthening America's position on the global stage. However, what wasn't fully addressed in the rush to implement these changes was the enormous cost that would come with them. The federal deficit, already a major concern before Trump's presidency, skyrocketed under his administration, largely as a result of his policies. And while short-term growth and stock market gains were visible, the long-term implications of these fiscal decisions were much darker. Trump's tax cuts were the first major blow to the nation's deficit. The Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, passed in late 2017, reduced corporate tax rates and provided temporary tax breaks for individuals. Initially, this seemed like a win for the economy. Corporate tax cuts were expected to spur investment, increase wages, and, in theory, lead to a thriving economy that could support itself without relying on borrowed money. However, what followed was a rapid increase in the national debt. The Congressional Budget Office, CBO, estimated that the tax cuts would add $1.9 trillion to the deficit over the next decade. The assumption that businesses would reinvest these tax cuts into the economy, creating jobs and stimulating growth, was not entirely realized. Instead, many companies used the additional funds for stock buybacks, which benefited shareholders more than workers. The resulting economic growth was not enough to offset the loss in tax revenue, but it wasn't just the tax cuts that contributed to the growing deficit. Trump's approach to military spending added another layer of complexity to the nation's fiscal outlook. Throughout his tenure, Trump consistently called for increased defense budgets, arguing that the U.S. needed to maintain its military dominance and ensure its safety in an increasingly uncertain world. His administration pushed for a sharp rise in military spending, with defense budgets reaching new heights. While there was widespread support for strengthening the military, the cost was staggering. The Trump administration allocated hundreds of billions of dollars to defense, diverting funds from other vital areas like healthcare, education, and infrastructure. The increased military spending was not without its consequences. It strained the federal budget, contributing to the swelling national debt. To make matters worse, the Trump administration pursued aggressive trade policies, most notably the trade war with China. The tariffs imposed on Chinese goods, intended to protect American manufacturing and reduce the trade deficit, further exacerbated the fiscal challenges. While the trade war was pitched as a way to bring jobs back to America, it also led to higher prices for American consumers. The tariffs on Chinese imports made everyday goods more expensive, which hurt the very middle class that Trump had promised to protect. The economic strain of the trade war added to the growing deficit, making it increasingly difficult to find a path to fiscal stability. In the midst of all this, the U.S. government found itself in a precarious position. It was borrowing more money than ever before, with no clear plan for repayment. By the time Trump left office in 2021, the national debt had reached record levels. This expansion of the deficit wasn't just a matter of numbers on a page. It had real consequences for the economy and for ordinary Americans. As the government borrowed more money, interest payments on the national debt soared, diverting funds that could have been used for essential public services. The increasing debt burden put future generations at risk, as they would be left to pay the price for the fiscal mismanagement of today. The national debt, once a distant concern for many, became a glaring issue that affected everything from government spending to interest rates. Trump's fiscal policies, while delivering short-term benefits to certain sectors, failed to address the long-term structural issues facing the economy. The massive tax cuts, the surge in military spending, and the growing debt all combined to create a perfect storm for the nation's fiscal future. The economic growth that Trump promised never fully materialized in a way that could sustainably support the nation's finances. Instead, the deficit ballooned, and the U.S. found itself in a cycle of borrowing that seemed increasingly unsustainable. Looking at the broader picture, the growing deficit had serious implications for future economic policy. With interest payments on the national debt rising, there was less money available for other priorities, such as healthcare, education, and infrastructure. The government was essentially locked into a situation where it had to borrow more just to service its existing debt. This limited the ability to make meaningful investments in the future, particularly in areas that could have contributed to long-term economic growth. The lack of a coherent plan to tackle the deficit left many questioning whether the short-term gains from Trump's fiscal policies were worth the long-term cost. As we reflect on the federal deficit crisis that emerged during Trump's presidency, it's impossible to ignore the magnitude of the challenge. The combination of tax cuts, military spending, and trade wars led to an unsustainable fiscal trajectory. While Trump's supporters argued that his policies would bring prosperity to America, the reality was that the nation's fiscal health was compromised. The massive deficit left future administrations with a daunting task. How do we fix a fiscal system that's been pushed to the brink? What are your thoughts on the growing deficit under Trump's administration? Did the tax cuts and increased military spending lead to the prosperity they promised, or did they create a fiscal crisis? Let us know in the comments below, and if you found this discussion valuable, please give the video a like. Don't forget to subscribe to stay updated on the ongoing consequences of these fiscal decisions and their impact on the global economy. Unintended consequences, the strain on public services. When we examine the fiscal policies enacted during Donald Trump's presidency, it's essential to recognize not only the intended benefits, but also the unintended consequences that became apparent as the years went by. While the administration was focused on tax cuts and deregulation as the keys to economic growth, the effects of these decisions began to spread through other sectors in ways that were far from anticipated. One of the most significant areas impacted by Trump's fiscal policies was public services, which have long been seen as the bedrock of American society. The reality, however, was that the tax cuts and increase in defense spending left fewer resources available for essential public services like healthcare, education, and infrastructure, leading to a growing strain on the nation's social safety net. At the core of the issue was the combination of drastically reduced federal revenue and a growing deficit. While corporations and high-income individuals reaped the rewards of the tax cuts, funding for essential services fell short. The tax cuts for businesses, particularly the dramatic reduction in corporate taxes, were supposed to result in reinvestment in the economy and, by extension, job creation and higher wages. Yet, much of the capital generated by these tax breaks went into stock buybacks, benefiting corporate executives and shareholders, while workers saw little real improvement in their wages. As a result, fewer tax dollars were available to fund the essential services that Americans rely on every day. Take healthcare, for example. One of Trump's major goals was to dismantle the Affordable Care Act, ACA, also known as Obamacare, which had expanded healthcare access to millions of Americans. While efforts to fully repeal the ACA were unsuccessful, the Trump administration worked tirelessly to weaken it. The administration reduced funding for outreach programs, which helped low-income individuals enroll in healthcare plans, and introduced policies that allowed states to impose stricter Medicaid work requirements. These actions made it harder for vulnerable populations to access affordable healthcare, and in some cases, they led to increases in the number of uninsured Americans. As the federal government cut back on funding for healthcare, the burden shifted to states and local governments, who found themselves struggling to make up the difference. The gap between those who needed healthcare and those who could afford it grew wider, further exacerbating the nation's inequality. The same can be said for education. Trump's fiscal policies, combined with his push for cuts to domestic spending, led to reductions in funding for public education, particularly in lower-income areas. School districts across the country were forced to make tough decisions, including cutting programs and increasing class sizes. The Trump administration's focus on tax cuts and military spending meant that there was less funding available to support educational initiatives that could have helped lift students out of poverty and into higher-paying jobs. The gap between rich and poor school districts only deepened, and as a result, children in disadvantaged communities faced even fewer opportunities for advancement. Infrastructure, which was also an area of focus for Trump, never received the attention it truly needed. Although the administration promised a major infrastructure overhaul, the reality was far from the bold vision that was presented. Instead of investing heavily in updating America's aging infrastructure, roads, bridges, public transportation systems, the funds that could have been used for these critical needs were diverted to military spending and tax cuts. As a result, America's infrastructure continued to deteriorate. Cities and states were left to fend for themselves, struggling to maintain and repair the crumbling roads and bridges that were essential to daily life. The consequences were not just financial, but also personal, with the safety of citizens directly affected by the lack of investment in public infrastructure. The impact of these cuts didn't stop at healthcare, education, and infrastructure. Public safety programs were also at risk. With the federal government's focus on military spending, local police and fire departments found themselves with limited resources. While the administration touted its efforts to support law enforcement, the reality was that the national deficit, exacerbated by Trump's policies, left fewer funds available for local communities. Programs that once provided vital support for local law enforcement, fire departments, and emergency services were threatened by budget cuts. This created a sense of instability in communities that relied on these services to protect their citizens and maintain public order. It's important to note that the tax cuts were designed to stimulate economic growth, but this theory never fully panned out in practice. As much as Trump and his supporters tried to present the policy as a way to empower the economy, the reality was that it simply didn't generate the type of broad-based growth that would have alleviated some of the strain on public services. Corporate profits soared, but the average American worker didn't see a substantial increase in wages or job opportunities. The public sector, which has always relied on government funding to function, was left grappling with the fallout from a policy that failed to deliver on its promises. The consequences of these fiscal policies created a vicious cycle. As public services continued to suffer, communities began to feel the pressure. As access to healthcare, education, and infrastructure became more limited, inequality continued to rise. The wealth gap, already a pressing issue, became more pronounced as the wealthiest Americans benefited from tax cuts, while the most vulnerable populations struggled to make ends meet. Public services that once served as a lifeline for many Americans were now stretched thin, unable to provide the support that was needed in times of crisis. The unfortunate reality is that these cuts to public services will likely have a lasting impact on American society. The effects on education, healthcare, and infrastructure will not be easily undone, and the gap between the rich and the poor will only continue to grow. The tax cuts may have benefited corporations and the wealthy in the short term, but the long-term effects on public services are clear. Communities across the country are feeling the strain, and the true cost of these fiscal policies will likely be felt for years to come. What do you think about the impact of Trump's fiscal policies on public services? Do you think the tax cuts and increased spending on defense were worth the strain they caused on healthcare, education, and infrastructure? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this video insightful, give it a like and don't forget to subscribe to stay updated on how these policies continue to affect our country. When Donald Trump initiated his trade war with China, it sent shockwaves through the global economy. His decision to impose tariffs on Chinese imports was a bold move designed to address what he considered to be unfair trade practices and the large trade deficit between the US and China. The goal was to pressure China into changing its economic policies, particularly regarding intellectual property rights, forced technology transfers, and market access. Trump's administration painted the trade war as a necessary step to protect American jobs and industries from what they saw as China's economic manipulation. However, while the trade war was championed as a victory for American workers, the reality was much more complicated, with unintended consequences that rippled through both the US economy and the global market. The first major impact of the trade war was the imposition of tariffs on billions of dollars worth of Chinese goods. The tariffs, which ranged from 10% to 25%, affected everything from electronics and machinery to agricultural products. The intention was simple: make Chinese goods more expensive in the US in order to make American-made products more competitive. The hope was that this would lead to an increase in domestic manufacturing and create jobs for American workers. But as the tariffs went into effect, it quickly became apparent that the cost of the trade war was not going to be borne solely by China. American businesses and consumers began to feel the pinch. For many US companies, the tariffs created significant challenges. Many businesses that relied on Chinese-made products for their supply chains saw their costs rise. Whether it was electronics manufacturers who relied on Chinese components or retailers who sourced inexpensive goods from China, the added tariffs meant higher production costs. Those costs were often passed on to consumers in the form of higher prices. While some industries were able to absorb the increased costs, others, particularly in the retail and tech sectors, found themselves facing reduced profit margins or higher prices for consumers. For many American families, this meant paying more for everyday goods, from smartphones to clothing to household appliances. At the same time, the promised benefits of the trade war were slow to materialize. The idea that American manufacturers would return home in droves due to the tariffs never fully came to fruition. Although some companies did shift their production to countries outside of China, the shift was far smaller than expected. Global supply chains are complex, and China's central role in manufacturing and trade meant that there were few viable alternatives for many companies. Moreover, the increased tariffs didn't necessarily lead to an immediate boost in domestic manufacturing. Instead, many industries continued to rely on their overseas operations, seeking cheaper labor and greater efficiency elsewhere. Agricultural producers were hit particularly hard by the trade war. In retaliation for US tariffs, China imposed its own tariffs on American goods, including agricultural products like soybeans, pork, and wheat. American farmers, particularly in rural states that relied heavily on exports to China, found themselves in a difficult position. China had been one of the largest buyers of American agricultural products, and the sudden loss of that market was devastating. Prices for soybeans, corn, and pork plummeted, and many farmers were forced to find new markets for their goods. To make matters worse, many of the countries that had been expected to take up the slack, such as the European Union and Japan, were already committed to long-term trade deals with China. In the end, US farmers were left without many viable options and struggled to stay afloat during the trade war. The damage caused by the trade war wasn't confined to businesses and workers. It had ripple effects throughout the global economy. China, the world's second-largest economy, responded with its own tariffs on US goods, leading to a slowdown in global trade. As the two largest economies in the world clashed, the entire international trading system was thrown into turmoil. Global supply chains were disrupted, and countries that depended on exports to the US or China were caught in the crossfire. Countries in Asia, Europe, and Latin America that relied on trade with both China and the US found themselves facing economic uncertainty. This created a sense of instability that not only affected businesses but also investors, who grew wary of the long-term impact of the trade war. The trade war also led to uncertainty in the stock market. While the market initially saw some gains from the promise of a tougher stance on China, the volatility caused by the trade war caused investor confidence to wane. The unpredictability of the trade negotiations, combined with the impact of tariffs on businesses, created a sense of instability in the financial markets. Investors were unsure of what to expect next, and stock prices fluctuated wildly as news of the trade talks came and went. The longer the trade war continued, the greater the uncertainty, and the more investors began to question whether the economic gains promised by Trump would ever be fully realized. One of the most significant long-term impacts of the trade war was the shift in global trade dynamics. As the US and China clashed, both countries sought to strengthen their economic ties with other nations. China, in particular, focused on expanding its trade relationships with countries in Africa, Latin America, and Asia, while the US attempted to create new trade deals with countries like Mexico, Canada, and Japan. This shift in focus meant that the balance of global power in trade was shifting, and countries were increasingly looking to diversify their trade relationships to avoid over-reliance on either China or the US. This broader geopolitical shift had implications for international diplomacy, trade negotiations, and the global economic order. In the end, the trade war with China proved to be a costly and unpredictable affair. While the US government touted some successes in the form of agreements with China to address certain trade practices, the overall economic impact was far more complex. American consumers paid higher prices, businesses faced increased costs, and farmers struggled to cope with the loss of key markets. The trade war also disrupted the global economy, leading to widespread uncertainty and volatility. As we look back on the trade war with China, it becomes clear that the hidden costs of these policies were far greater than many anticipated. What do you think about the impact of Trump's trade war with China? Did the tariffs truly benefit the US, or did they create more harm than good? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this video insightful, don't forget to give it a like and subscribe to stay updated on the lasting effects of the trade war on the global economy. Canada shuts down cargo planes. What does this mean for global trade? In the midst of the economic turmoil caused by Donald Trump's fiscal policies, another unexpected crisis emerged in the form of a bold move by Canada, the decision to shut down its airports to cargo planes. This sudden action, though seemingly isolated to one country, has far-reaching implications for global trade and highlights the fragility of international supply chains. As we've seen throughout the past few years, trade is the lifeblood of the global economy. When one country makes a move like this, it doesn't just affect its own borders, it sends shockwaves that reverberate across continents, affecting businesses, consumers, and economies worldwide. Canada's decision to close its airports to cargo planes was in response to a combination of factors, many of which can be traced back to the economic instability created by global trade wars, fluctuating tariffs, and the broader impact of national fiscal policies. Although Canada's move may have appeared as a local issue, it was directly linked to the growing tensions that were exacerbated by Trump's trade policies. With tariffs between the US and China hitting a fever pitch, businesses on both sides of the border were already grappling with the fallout. Companies that relied on cross-border trade, particularly in North America, found themselves caught in a web of rising costs, disruptions, and uncertainty. When Canada shut down its cargo planes, it was not just about the immediate economic fallout for businesses that were unable to ship their goods. It was also about the disruption of a finely tuned global supply chain that relies on efficient transport of goods across borders. For industries like manufacturing, tech, and agriculture, sectors that are heavily dependent on the quick and reliable movement of goods, this shutdown was catastrophic. Goods that once flowed seamlessly across borders now faced delays, bottlenecks, and higher costs, which created a ripple effect that affected businesses not only in Canada and the US, but around the world. The broader implications of Canada's move were felt most keenly in industries that depend on the transport of raw materials and finished products. For example, the automotive and tech industries, which rely on components manufactured in various countries, suddenly found themselves unable to get the parts they needed. Factories that were already running on tight schedules faced delays in production, leading to inventory shortages and ultimately higher prices for consumers. Tech companies, which depend on the steady flow of electronics components, were particularly hard hit. With delays in shipments, the cost of producing everything from smartphones to computers increased, and the strain on the supply chain only grew worse as more restrictions were implemented. This situation exemplifies the interconnectedness of today's global economy. While Canada's cargo plane shutdown may have been a response to domestic issues, it ultimately revealed the vulnerability of the international trade system, which was already under pressure from the broader economic policies of the Trump administration. The unpredictability of international trade, heightened by tariffs, trade wars, and geopolitical tensions, made companies reconsider their reliance on traditional global supply chains. The result was not just about increased costs and delays, but also about a shift in the way businesses approach trade in the long term. Companies that had once relied on fast and efficient global trade routes were now questioning whether they needed to look for alternatives closer to home, as the risk of disruptions like this one seemed ever present. The Canadian shutdown also highlighted the fragility of logistics in a world where speed and efficiency are key. In an era where consumers expect goods to be delivered quickly and at low costs, any disruption in the movement of products can lead to a significant loss of consumer confidence. Think about it. The online shopping boom, fueled by Amazon and other e-commerce giants, has conditioned people to expect rapid delivery times. The moment that promise is broken, whether it's because of tariffs, shipping delays, or even a shutdown like the one Canada implemented, the impact is felt immediately. Businesses that rely on meeting tight delivery schedules face not just financial losses, but also reputational damage, which can take years to repair. While the direct consequences of Canada's cargo plane shutdown were immediately felt in the North American market, the ripple effects extended globally. Countries that are major trading partners with Canada, such as Mexico, Japan, and those in the European Union, found themselves caught in the crossfire. Supply chains that once relied on efficient and predictable routes were now facing the uncertainty of whether goods would make it to their destinations on time. This uncertainty led to increased costs for goods worldwide, making it harder for consumers to find affordable products. One of the most significant long-term effects of this disruption is the potential shift in global trade dynamics. As businesses begin to feel the strain of such disruptions, they may start looking for alternatives to the traditional methods of transporting goods. This could lead to an increased focus on regional supply chains, with countries closer to each other beginning to forge stronger trade relationships to reduce the risk of disruptions from global trade wars or economic instability. In many ways, the Canadian cargo plane shutdown may have been a canary in the coal mine, a warning that the traditional systems of international trade, long considered robust and reliable, are not as stable as once believed. The truth is, Canada's move exposed a much deeper vulnerability within the global trade system, one that has been growing for years, as governments, especially those like the US, who did increasingly adopt protectionist policies. We may see more countries taking similar steps to protect their own economic interests. These moves could lead to further fragmentation of the global economy, with countries focusing more on internal markets and reducing reliance on global trade. While this might seem like a solution in the short term, the long-term consequences could be far-reaching, leading to higher costs, less innovation, and slower economic growth worldwide. What do you think about Canada's decision to shut down its airports to cargo planes? Do you think this move was a sign of things to come for global trade? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you found this video insightful, be sure to give it a like and subscribe for more in-depth discussions on the shifting landscape of global trade. The ripple effect. How Trump's fiscal policies affected international relations. One of the most profound yet often overlooked consequences of Donald Trump's fiscal policies was the far-reaching impact they had on international relations. His administration's approach to trade, defense spending, and even foreign aid reshaped the way the U.S. interacted with the rest of the world, and the effects continue to reverberate today. While Trump supporters often lauded his America First stance, focusing on boosting the U.S. economy and protecting American jobs, his policies often came at the expense of strained relationships with long-standing allies and increased tensions with adversaries. What seemed like a strategy to secure American interests often created a web of uncertainty, shaking the foundation of established diplomatic ties and altering the balance of global power. Take, for instance, Trump's aggressive stance on trade. From the very beginning of his presidency, the U.S. sought to renegotiate or withdraw from key international trade agreements. Trump pulled the U.S. out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership, TPP, a trade deal that involved 11 countries in the Asia-Pacific region. His reasoning was that the deal was unfair to American workers and industries, particularly in sectors like manufacturing. While the move was initially heralded as a bold stance against globalism, it alienated several countries in the region and led to a shift in the economic balance of power. The TPP, despite being without the U.S., continued as the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, CPTPP, with Japan and Australia emerging as leaders in driving it forward. In many ways, Trump's decision opened the door for other countries to step up and claim leadership in global trade, diminishing the influence of the U.S. in the Asia-Pacific. Moreover, Trump's trade war with China not only hurt the US and China, but also had cascading effects on the global economy. As the US imposed tariffs on Chinese goods, China retaliated, and soon many other countries found themselves caught in the crossfire. Global supply chains were disrupted, and businesses from Europe to Africa had to navigate the chaos created by the tariffs. Countries that had been major trade partners with the U.S. now found themselves re-evaluating their own trade relationships. Some sought to strengthen ties with China, while others began looking more favorably at regional trade agreements. The result was an increasingly fragmented global economy, where alliances based on trade and mutual economic benefit became more fluid and uncertain. The U.S., once the dominant player on the global economic stage, found itself facing new challenges as countries sought to diversify their trade relationships and reduce their dependency on U.S. markets. At the same time, Trump's foreign policy decisions, particularly his stance on NATO, deepened divisions within the Western alliance. Trump's criticism of NATO and his repeated calls for member countries to contribute more to the defense budget sent shockwaves through Europe. While Trump's message was clear, he wanted European allies to pull their weight. His approach to the issue, often delivered with public outbursts and harsh rhetoric, alienated many of America's closest partners. Instead of strengthening the alliance, Trump's actions sowed discord, with several NATO countries questioning the reliability of the U.S. as a partner. The 2017 meeting at the NATO summit was a prime example of the tension, where Trump publicly berated European leaders for not meeting defense spending targets, undermining years of cooperation and trust. For many European countries, this left them wondering whether the US could still be counted on as a stable ally, or if they would have to pursue their own defense strategies in the future. Trump's foreign policy also extended to his approach toward international institutions like the United Nations and the World Trade Organization. His administration's "America First" mantra led to the withdrawal of the US from several key global agreements, including the Paris Climate Accord and the Iran nuclear deal. These moves not only isolated the US, but also sent a message to the world that the US was no longer committed to multilateralism and was willing to go it alone. While Trump justified these decisions as protecting American interests, they were seen by many as a retreat from global leadership, allowing China and Russia to fill the void left by the US withdrawal. As the US distanced itself from key global initiatives, countries like China and the European Union worked to strengthen their influence in global governance. The diplomatic space that was once dominated by the US began to shift toward these rising powers. Even more than trade agreements and foreign policy, Trump's fiscal policies had an indirect but equally significant impact on international relations through foreign aid. Trump made it clear early on that he wanted to reduce US foreign aid, viewing it as a drain on American resources. The cuts to foreign aid programs, particularly those aimed at global development, health initiatives, and humanitarian efforts, sent a strong message to the world that the US was no longer willing to play a leading role in global development. This move left many countries in the developing world seeking new partnerships with countries that were more willing to step in and provide the aid that the US had historically offered. China, in particular, took advantage of this shift by offering investments and loans to countries across Africa, Asia, and Latin America. These loans were often presented as part of China's Belt and Road Initiative, a massive global infrastructure project aimed at expanding China's influence through investments in transportation, energy, and technology projects. While this allowed China to expand its reach, it also contributed to a rebalancing of global influence. The results of these fiscal and foreign policy decisions were not just felt in the US. They were part of a larger reshaping of international relations that left countries around the world grappling with the consequences. While some nations welcomed the opportunity to negotiate with a less assertive US, others found themselves uncertain about where they stood in a world that seemed increasingly divided. As the US distanced itself from long-standing global alliances and trade agreements, the balance of power shifted. Countries that had once relied on the US as a leader in global trade and diplomacy began to seek new partnerships, recalibrating their strategies in response to the changing global order. How do you think Trump's fiscal policies and foreign decisions impacted international relations? Do you believe the US has lost its leadership role in the world, or do you think these shifts were temporary? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this analysis, be sure to give the video a like and subscribe to stay updated on the lasting the future of fiscal policy. Will Biden change the course? Topic 8. As we've delved into the impact of Trump's fiscal policies, one question that inevitably arises is, what happens next? With the shift from the Trump administration to the Biden presidency, there was a seismic change in the direction of US fiscal policy. Biden's approach to the economy, especially in contrast to Trump's, seems more focused on addressing the inequality that was exacerbated during the previous administration, ensuring healthcare accessibility, and tackling the climate crisis, all while attempting to rebuild trust in the US government after years of economic division. But will Biden's policies effectively reverse or mitigate the damage done by Trump's fiscal decisions? Or are we simply heading down a different path to face similar challenges? The centerpiece of Biden's economic agenda has been the emphasis on increasing government spending, not through tax cuts, but by expanding social programs, enhancing infrastructure, and responding to the COVID-19 pandemic. One of the first moves Biden made was to pass a massive $1.9 trillion stimulus package to provide direct relief to Americans struggling due to the pandemic. This contrasted sharply with Trump's focus on tax cuts, which primarily benefited corporations and high-income earners. Biden's stimulus plan included direct payments to individuals, extended unemployment benefits, and significant investments in vaccine distribution, aiming to get the country back on its feet after the economic devastation caused by the global health crisis. This move has been largely seen as an immediate attempt to address the economic inequality that became apparent during Trump's tenure. Biden has also pushed for major infrastructure projects, which would not only improve the country's crumbling roads and bridges, but also create jobs and stimulate long-term growth. One of Biden's key promises was to reverse the tax cuts that Trump implemented, particularly those benefiting the wealthy and large corporations. While Biden has yet to propose a full repeal of Trump's tax cuts, he has aimed at raising taxes on high-income earners and corporations, with the belief that a more progressive tax system will help fund his ambitious plans. Biden's Build Back Better plan includes raising the corporate tax rate from 21% to 28%, which, although still lower than pre-Trump levels, would bring in significant revenue to support public services. The rationale behind these proposals is that wealthier Americans and large corporations should contribute more to the economy, especially given that the wealth gap widened during the previous administration. Critics, however, argue that raising taxes on corporations could discourage investment and stifle economic growth, while others claim that it's a necessary step to ensure that those who have benefited most from the economy help fund the programs that benefit the broader population. Biden's fiscal approach also involves a greater emphasis on social safety nets. One of his signature policy proposals has been to expand access to health care, building upon the Affordable Care Act that Trump repeatedly tried to dismantle. Biden has called for lowering the age for Medicare eligibility, which would provide healthcare access to millions of older Americans, and has proposed the creation of a public healthcare option that would allow people to choose government-run insurance over private plans. While these plans are ambitious, they could also face significant opposition, especially from Republicans, who continue to push for less government involvement in healthcare. The fiscal cost of such expansions would be substantial, but Biden's administration argues that a healthier population can lead to long-term economic growth and reduced healthcare costs in the future. Another crucial element of Biden's fiscal strategy is addressing climate change, which has not only become an urgent global concern, but also a matter of economic security. Trump's environmental deregulations were seen by many as harmful to long-term sustainability, especially considering the economic toll that climate disasters, hurricanes, wildfires, flooding, have on communities and infrastructure. Biden's policies on climate change represent a dramatic shift in focus as his administration pushes for substantial investments in clean energy, carbon reduction, and green technologies. Biden's American Jobs Plan allocates funds for the transition to renewable energy sources, modernizing the electrical grid and creating high-paying green jobs. While these initiatives are necessary for long-term environmental stability, they also represent a significant financial commitment, and their success will depend on both domestic political support and international cooperation. One of the biggest challenges that Biden faces, however, is dealing with the legacy of Trump's fiscal policies. The tax cuts, the ballooning deficit, and the federal debt have left the U.S. with a fiscal challenge that Biden cannot ignore. While Biden's proposals aim to address inequality and invest in the future, the question remains whether the government can balance its ambitious plans with the reality of an enormous national debt. If the Biden administration is unable to generate enough revenue through taxes or achieve sustainable growth, the US could find itself trapped in a cycle of borrowing and increasing deficits, much like the situation under Trump. Additionally, as global markets shift, Biden will need to navigate a new economic landscape shaped by the lasting effects of Trump's trade wars, the fallout from the COVID-19 pandemic, and an increasingly multipolar global economy. Biden's approach marks a shift toward more expansive government spending, a greater role for public services, and a more progressive tax system, but the success of these policies will depend on the ability to enact and sustain them in the face of opposition. While the Biden administration has emphasized cooperation with allies, it must also confront the challenges left by the previous administration, not just in terms of fiscal policy, but also in restoring trust in U.S. leadership on the global stage. The decisions made in the next few years will have lasting consequences, determining whether the country can recover from the economic divide caused by Trump's policies, or whether the cycle of inequality and debt will continue. What do you think? Do you believe Biden's fiscal policies will be able to reverse the effects of Trump's economic approach, or do you think the challenges are too great? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you found this video insightful, don't forget to give it a like and subscribe to stay updated on the ongoing changes in U.S. fiscal policy and their impact on both the nation and the world. Effects of Trump's policies on global relations. If you've made it this far, we'd love to hear how this video resonated with you. Please leave a comment below saying, "I liked the content," and share how this message has spoken to your heart. Don't forget to subscribe to the channel so you can keep receiving transformative content. Leave a like to support this mission, and of course, make sure to watch the next video that's already on the final screen. May God bless your life abundantly.